Good morning, Nexus. Welcome to another Sunday morning online. Glad that you have joined us this morning. Good to be with you. And I want to talk this morning about nuance. You see, we seem to find ourselves in the midst of a time, we have been for a while, I'd almost call it a new purity paradigm, you could say, where polarization and the fetishization of differences means that being on the right side of any given issue is seen as a matter of virtue and purity. And whether we're talking about COVID safety measures, masks, abortion, sexuality, cannabis, notions of freedom, politics, whatever it is, very quickly in these conversations, it can start to feel like a bit of a purity test. Get something wrong or even show sympathy towards the wrong people, the wrong opposing viewpoint, and you can end up starting to feel vilified and impure almost. And so again, this morning I want to make the case for nuance and nuanced thinking. And to do that, I want to make a case or show you something from Scripture I find interesting. But before I get to that, I want to present you with a social experiment where you, the viewer, play the role of jury in a dramatic court case. So at the end of this story, I'd like to somehow take a vote or at least weigh in, tell me what you think you would do. And what I want to ask of you this morning is this. Do you think Raffi Kadikian should be found guilty of second-degree murder? That's the question in front of us. That's what you'll be voting on, whether you type in the comments or just do it in your head. That's your job as a jury this morning, you could say. And for those of you who are like, okay, well, if that's what we're doing, what's the definition of second-degree murder? Here it is in its simplest form. Second-degree murder is a deliberate killing that occurs without planning. It will also be helpful for you to know that the minimum sentence is life in prison with no parole for 10 years, but sentences can be as long as 25 years without parole. But for our sake, let's frame the question this way. Should Raffi Kadikian be found guilty of second-degree murder knowing that he will spend 10 years in prison at least before he is eligible for parole? That's the question in front of us this morning. Fair warning, there are a few little grisly details, not too bad or anything, but if you got kids in the room or you know, if there's some things that you're not a big fan of murder mysteries, maybe come back in 5-10 minutes, whatever it is. But that's the case in front of us, Raffi Kadikian. Let's dive into the story. You see, Dave Coughlin and Raffi Kadikian had grown up together in Boston. They had been best friends throughout high school and college, and they spent the majority of their time together, hanging out in the evenings, hanging out with other friends. But when Dave was accepted into graduate school in California, the two friends knew that this was the end of an era in their friendship, of course. And so the two decided to do and end this chapter of their friendship by embarking, you could say, on a rite of passage that's as old as the automobile itself. They were going to road trip across America from Boston to Dave's new home in California. And the plan was simple. They'd drive across in Dave's car, and once Dave was settled there, Raffi would take a flight back home. And so after spending the better part of a decade as best friends, this seemed like the perfect way to send Dave off into a new trajectory in life. And so the two took off in their car. Alternating nights, they spent camping or crashing in cheap hotels. But the two, interestingly enough, kept diaries of their life on the road, this road trip. And by all accounts, the two were having the time of their lives traveling across America, soaking in the sights, the sounds of a road trip like no other. And a few weeks into their departure, the two arrived in New Mexico on August 4th, 1999, and they planned to spend a night camping in Carlsbad Caverns National Park. And they were simply looking for a quick overnight sleep, so they stopped at the information center of the park and they inquired of a park ranger, hey, where's a good place to camp quickly so we can sleep, be on our way the next morning? And so the ranger armed them with a topographical map and advised them to camp in Rattlesnake Canyon. Now, its trailhead lay just a 20-minute drive away from the information center, and he told them that once they got to the trailhead, they could hike down the trail a little bit, find a camping spot suitable for them in about 10 minutes. And so before leaving the information center, though, The two would make a rather fateful decision. Thinking their stay was a quick overnight, the two of them bought 3 500 milliliter bottles of water and 1 bottle of Gatorade. The two friends found parking at the trailhead just as the ranger has instructed them, and then armed with their tent, their liquids, and a few hot dogs, they made their way down a trail lined with waist-high thicket brush. They took a turn at a fork in the trail and then hiked for about 10 minutes until they found this beautiful camping spot tucked into this little cove in the canyon. They made camp, used one of the water bottles to boil their hot dogs, and called it a night. And by the next morning, all of their water and their Gatorade was now gone. But they packed up thinking they'd return to their car quickly, made their way back to the car. But as they were traveling, the terrain suddenly just seemed unfamiliar to them. They couldn't find the fork in the path that they had taken the previous evening. They couldn't find the trail they had traveled through waist-high thicket brush. And so the two circled back and forth between where they had camped and where they suspected the trail leading back to their car to be. But within an hour of doing this, they realized they had somehow lost their bearings. The two were lost in the New Mexico desert with no food and no water. Now, of course, temperatures hover at around 30 degrees Celsius in Rattlesnake Canyon, and its terrain is harsh. There's no trees, there's just bushes, most of them not even as high as your waist. And so in Rattlesnake Canyon, shade is next to impossible to find. And so growing concerned, the two started laboring, and their labor went on for hours and hours as they traced and retraced their steps over and over again, trying to find this trail. But after 10 full hours of searching, the two found themselves severely dehydrated, sunburnt, frustrated, and spent. And so as the sun set, the two made camp again at the exact same spot they had camped the night before, thinking, you know what, maybe in the morning our heads would be clear and they could find their way back to the car. But the next morning was painful. Their mouths were cracked and dry. Their bodies were aching from too much time in the sun. And so the two painfully broke camp, determined no matter what, they were going to hike out of the wilderness on that day. They would simply keep going in a direction until they hit a road or found something. But all throughout that second day, their bodies were screaming at them. They had gone a full day in the scorching heat without a drop of water. Every step felt painful for them. And over the hours of that second day, they began to get desperate. They resorted to licking moist rocks, drinking their own urine, and eating prickly pear cactus fruit. And again, they labored all day trying to find their way, but by the time the sun set on the second day, they were still lost and now even more confused, more demoralized, and their bodies were on the verge of total breakdown. The two hadn't had any liquids for 48 hours, and that's after spending 2 days in the scorching heat of New Mexico. That night for them trying to sleep, it was just pain. Their bodies convulsed in severe spasms. They both began vomiting. Their bodies seemed to be shutting down on them. And by the time the sun rose on the third day, they were resolved to try again, but their bodies at this point simply wouldn't cooperate. They managed to find close by more prickly pear cactus fruit. They devoured it, hoping for any moisture, any calories that it could help afford them, but their bodies were spent. They couldn't find the energy to move, let alone search for a way out. And so the two spent most of that third day lying in their tent, trying to keep cool. But late in the day, they noticed something horrifying. Buzzards overhead were circling around them as if waiting for the two to die. And the birds rotated and rotated, and the two began to envision themselves becoming carrion for vultures, and without any strength to move, no water for 3 days now, except what they could squeeze out from prickly pear cactus fruit, the two at that point resigned themselves to their fate. They were going to die. In realizing this, the two of them each scrawled out a final farewell message to their loved ones in their journal, and having finished that, waited for the end to come. And as that evening set in, the horrors for them only escalated. David's body was overcome with intense vomiting and body paralysis from spasms, and he began begging Dave to kill him. They were going to die anyway, he pleaded. Just end it for him, end his suffering. And of course, Raffi, his best friend, initially protested, but for 2 hours, Dave insisted he didn't want to suffer any longer. And so, finally, Raffi agreed. He took his camping knife and plunged it once and then a second time into Dave's chest, the second stab piercing his heart, and minutes later, Dave Coughlin was dead on the desert floor. And in that moment, Raffi couldn't stomach the idea of watching Dave's body be picked at by vultures while he himself slowly died, and so summoning all his strength, he dragged Dave's body a short distance from the tent and covered his body with stones, some of them inexplicably weighing as heavy as 70 pounds. And at this point, he was so completely exhausted, he tried to actually take his own life. He just didn't have the strength to do it with any conviction. And that night, he finally passed out, only to wake hours later to find 2 park rangers hovering above him. They immediately began to administer first aid to Raffi, and of course the Rangers were asking him what had happened, and Raffi replied matter-of-factly, "I killed my friend and buried him over there." Medics arrived on the scene and worked to rehydrate him through IV. A rescue helicopter was called in to airlift him to safety, but even before it had lifted off the ground to bring him to the hospital, Raffi also found himself being handcuffed, charged with second-degree murder. Because you see, in New Mexico, as in many other places, there is no law that allows for mercy killing. Regardless of the circumstances, Raffi was guilty of murder and faced 10 to 25 years in prison without parole. In a pre-trial hearing, Raffi would learn that an autopsy report revealed this about his friend Dave. Yes, he was severely dehydrated. Yes, he was assuredly in pain. But the report found his body water levels weren't yet at life-threatening levels. Moreover, the report found that the reason the pair were vomiting and had body spasms is because they had eaten unripened cactus fruit, which causes severe abdominal pain, vomiting. But it usually isn't fatal. So what Raffi learned in the pre-trial is that had he refused his friend's request to kill him, in all likelihood, the two of them would still be alive. Raffi would also learn about his ordeal that the two of them were never, the whole time, more than 30 minutes away from the car that they had parked in a lot not too far away. Moreover, they would be informed that trail markers were visible, at least to the experienced hiker, and roads were within sight if they had climbed up some of these ridges. So what had happened? Of course, defense lawyers chalked all of this up to the effects of dehydration. Not a single person could be found anywhere who could testify to there being any sort of bad blood between the two friends. More than that, Dave's own family testified that they didn't believe Raffi had acted with any sort of malice. Defense medical experts, they testified how heat-related panic has been documented for hundreds of years, and that under conditions that Dave and Raffi were suffering under, it could have easily put them in a mental state where they would make irrational decisions. Raffi's lawyers also argued that under the same set of circumstances, anyone might have done the same thing. This, they said, wasn't a case of second-degree murder, but extraordinary circumstances where a friend was simply trying to ease the suffering of another. But again, New Mexico doesn't allow for mercy killings. In court, the question was a simple one, black and white. Had Raffi committed second-degree murder? And with that, did he deserve to spend 10 years in prison before having a chance of parole? And so, I put the question to you, this tragic story. If you were sitting on a jury, should Raffi Kadikian be found guilty of second-degree murder, knowing that he would spend 10 years in prison at least before he is eligible for parole? Tough question. How do you respond? How are we even supposed to think through something like that? As you think about it, think about your own response. I will tell you how the court case did in fact play out. After the pre-trial, defense lawyers asked Raffi to plead innocent on the grounds that he was temporarily insane due to hydration. However, Raffi didn't want to take the risk of fighting the charges and decided to plead guilty in exchange for a lighter sentence. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, only served 16 years and the rest of it on parole. And of course, you're probably asking yourself, why tell you that sort of grisly, tragic story this morning? First of all, I like desert stories like these. They fascinate me, what the human is capable of under extraordinary circumstances. But the story illustrates something really important to me. Life is complicated. And I think a story like this illustrates the poverty of always thinking in strictly right and wrong. Some questions are more complicated than whether someone is guilty or not guilty, right or wrong, black or white. Because when forced to decide whether Raffi is guilty of second-degree murder, I mean, we can't help but think, can we? Whoa, wait a second here. Sure, yes, he might be guilty in the strictest sense of the term, but there's a big but attached to that. And of course, it's a profound tragedy, but there's a lot to consider here. This is more complex than a simple question of did he kill someone deliberately? There's a lot more to the story. So yes, he did kill someone, but he did so to end someone's suffering. And more so, his thinking was clouded by exceptional physical hardships. The question of whether he is guilty or deserves jail time feels nuanced, layered, complex. Too complex to be narrowed down to a simple yes or no verdict. And you know, I'm inclined to think that this story could sort of stand in. It's an illustration, I think, for virtually all of the matters that we tend to disagree and fight about today, be that in the church or in culture at large. Most of the big issues we tend to disagree about, in my estimation, they feel like a Raffi Kadikian case. They're complex. They're nuanced. They're far too layered to be simply labeled as right or wrong, yes or no. And yet everywhere today we're asked, right, and to fit into a comfortable box. Are you left or are you right? Are you affirming or not? Pro this or pro that? Vaxxed or not? Masks or no masks? Be it COVID safety measures, politics, abortion, sexuality, cannabis, addressing housing, war, violence, all of these things are far more complex and nuanced than we imagine. And I can't help but think we would do well to resist the push to place ourselves in a camp or side. You see, the early church faced this struggle as well, and the ways in which the early church handled some of their earliest struggles, it's instructive and I think worth visiting. Because you see, one of the struggles in the early church concerned meat that had been sacrificed to idols. Now, that sounds distant to us. I suppose in some ways we have similar debates, I suppose, on food ethics today. But most of us, I think, vegan or carnivore, for the most part, I think we seem to be okay with agreeing to disagree. But to first century believers, this issue was a matter of great consequence. I mean, this was the issue. And the pressure for the early church was the same pressure that we face today. Well, what is it? What camp are you in? Pro meat sacrifice to idols or against it? That's so often the pressure we face as groups. And you see, the issue was this: in the early years of the church, as Gentile converts began joining this Jewish movement, as they began collecting in communities, an issue arose concerning the nature of meat and idols. Because Greco-Roman culture, it was saturated, right, with idol worship. They were everywhere, and it was common for meat sold in the marketplace to have been consecrated as a sacrifice to these idol gods prior to them being put on sale. And so for Hebrew people, with their dietary laws, with their background and idolatry and being told to stay against it, I mean, this was out of bounds. This was a no-go for them. They had nothing to do with it. They wanted nothing to do with it because for them, it seemed to be giving like tacit approval to idol worship. But the Gentiles, on the other hand, they're like, "Oh, this makes no sense." They'd rejected the notion that meat was tainted simply because it had been offered to a sacrifice. They hadn't done the offering. And so this matter was like this huge point of contention in the early church. And as the church dealt with the issue, what we find is an incredible story of nuanced thinking in action. And what we find is how the church responded to this challenge wasn't monolithic. There wasn't a universal application. This is how the church deals with this. There was no line in the sand. What they did was deal with the issue in a local context, on a case-by-case basis, depending, you could say, on what the local church could handle. And so for the early church, there was no one right way to think about this. It all depended on context. And in Scripture, we're given 3 snapshots, 3 case tests of how different churches handled this. The first church struggling with this was one in Syrian Antioch. And this is the closest church we have to the Hebrew heartland. And of course, this church was split pretty evenly between Jews and Gentiles. And the issue was so heated for this church that they actually sent a letter looking for advice from the Jerusalem council. They're looking for advice, you could say, from church headquarters. And this is the advice that church headquarters, the Jerusalem council, sends back to them. It seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us not to burden you with anything beyond the following requirements. You are to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. You will do well to avoid these things. Farewell. Now, notice the language here. It seemed good. This is a tough one. It's like they're saying, we're not exactly sure how best to handle this, but this seems good to us, and you would do well. It's not, this is our firm stance. No, you just do this. No, it's like, this seems good, and I think you do well to follow our advice here. And what is the rationale behind that? Well, this decision was made not, of course, to promote any sort of legalism. It was promoted to keep peace within a church that was highly divided. And since eating meat offered to idols was such a divisive issue, the thinking was, you know what, let's just abstain just to sort of get rid of this problem. But why? See, again, to me, it comes down to context. This is a church that's at least 50% Hebrew, and this is bothering their conscience. And so the decision by the Jerusalem council is a very practical one. The leaders have in mind, because they're thinking about here the next church potluck. And what they're thinking about is Hebrew people showing up and going, oh my goodness, I can't eat any of this because it's been offered to idols. And they're also thinking that Hebrews are going to look around at the Gentile people going, oh my goodness, these people are idol worshipers. There's like, you know what? It's not worth it. We can get meat. We're close enough to Israel here. We can find meat that hasn't been sacrificed to idols. So let's just take the option off the table. What is in mind here is compromise, keeping the peace, consideration of others. And yet the interesting thing to me is we have an entirely different take in the book of 1 Corinthians. Remember, Corinth, unlike Antioch, it doesn't sit on the borderlands with Israel. I mean, we're talking a radically different context. We're in the heartland of the Roman Empire. Finding meat not sacrificed to idols would be next to impossible. This again is the issue, but notice how Paul addresses it. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols. We know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. Food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. So we eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever's put before you without raising questions of conscience. Be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. We're in a much more Gentile-heavy context here, and Paul is dealing with this issue in a context, a local context. And of course, they're still in the church. There's Hebrews' voice and concern. Their voice is there, and this is a problem, they're saying to Paul. How are we going to deal with it? And he sort of settles the score here, sort of in a final way. He's like, it's not a big deal to eat meat sacrificed to idols. And why? Well, first, an idol is nothing, so who cares? Second, the earth is the Lord's, everything in it, it's meat, enjoy it. This is Paul acting almost, you could say, like a judge in the Raffi Kadikian case. He hammers out a verdict. This is clearly second-degree murder, or more accurately in this case, there's clearly nothing wrong with eating meat sacrificed to idols. And yet, even here, there's a but. But there's nuance and complexity. Paul goes on, sure, he says essentially, on one level, this is a black and white issue. And yet on another level, it's anything but that. There's a caveat. There's nuance here. And what Paul is getting, I think, at is this. On the Jesus path, we always, always, always consider the community and the other above ourselves. And so the meat itself, you could say, is amoral. There's not even a morality question there. However, there is more to consider, and namely that someone's conscience is still bothered by this kind of meat due to their upbringing, their background. Some believers, especially with background and maybe idol worship, they're very sensitive concerning this issue, and they do consider it morally wrong. And so Paul says, listen, it's not that. It's not a moral issue. Enjoy your freedom, but under no circumstance should a Jesus path person encourage someone to violate their conscience. The principle here is, you could say, the conscience of someone else is more important than individual freedoms. And man, I wish we would sort of get this today on the Jesus path. We don't try to push people where their conscience will not allow them to go. And yet, that seems so hard for us to grasp today. It is okay that people are at different places. And you know, there's this train of thought within the church with a lot of people that sort of argues for things like this. You know, when it comes to contentious issues in the church, we just need all of us to get around a table and hash it out, and let's hope the Holy Spirit guides us into some sort of consensus. We just need to keep having discussion groups and book clubs and just keep talking and talking and talking about certain issues until we find some sort of common ground. We're all on the same page. And to that, I would say, no, actually, we don't have to do that. We don't need consensus. We don't need uniformity. We don't need definitive statements or policies to move forward as a community. We just don't. It's okay that we all don't have the same conscience. And what one person is bothered by, another might not be. And so to the Corinth community, it's like Paul is saying, just leave it alone. You meat eaters, you don't need to keep making your case, right? You don't need to keep going up to the sensitive Hebrews being like, hey, if you could just hear me out here, I've got a PowerPoint presentation. I'd like to make the case to you why, eating meat sacrificed to idols is no big deal. Just hear me out. And Paul's like, You don't need to do that. We don't have to be on the same page. You don't need to tempt or try to override someone's conscience. And if you're doing that, Paul's like, what are you doing? Don't tempt someone to violate their conscience. Leave it alone. Do your thing and leave it alone. The question is not in the church, can we all agree or can we help others see how right we are? Rather, the question is always in the church, are we willing to be together, share the Eucharist meal together in spite of our differences? Our consciences will lead us to different conclusions on many different things. And some ultimately may be more right than others in the grand scheme of things, but those things don't define the Jesus path. Can we, in spite of differing consciences, come together and agree to try to love one another? That is what defines the Jesus path. Not a church's position on idol meat, or abortion, or politics, or sexuality, or cannabis, or whatever else we want to disagree about. And I love where Paul lands, and yet there is also a third case, and it throws a whole other layer of complexity on top of this issue. And this one comes straight from Jesus in Revelation 2. He's speaking to the church in Thyatira. He says, I know your deeds, your love and faith, your service and perseverance, and that you are now doing more than you did at first. Nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet, and by her teaching she misleads my servants into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. I've given her time to repent of her morality, but she is unwilling. Now, it sounds to me like Jesus is totally contradicting Paul here. No, Jesus is saying, eating meat offered to idols is wrong. But again, is that what's happening? Well, once again, I think this is nuanced around a particular local context because there was a strong association in Thyatira between food offered to idols and sexual orgies, you could say, involving sexual slavery. You see, from what historians can gather, in Thyatira there was a strong labor guild, unions, you could say, for weaving, leather, pottery, making bronze, that sort of thing. And these guilds, again, they're essentially unions. They formed leagues who promoted and protected their trade and those who worked for them. And so in this environment, each of these guilds, these unions, they have their gods who they worship in hope of success and prosperity. And these unions also held these religious festivals, and what that involved was sharing in this feast of meat sacrificed to their idol god, and these feasts would regularly end with orgies within a god's temple by sex slaves employed there. And so this is a really complex and challenging issue for the Jesus people in Thyatira. I mean, first of all, if you don't belong to a guild, a union, it's going to be hard to get work. So what do you do? And so this is already a challenge, but then along comes this prophetess apparently saying, don't worry, it's no big deal. Just join the union, get a job, go to the feast, do what you need to do there. It's not a big deal. But when food and idols are strongly connected to something that is beyond the pale morally, even as we consider sex today, in that context, I think what Jesus is saying is there's way too strong of a link here between meat sacrificed to idols and really awful sexual stuff. And so when there's that strong of a correlation, you just have to leave it behind. And you know, I think we get this intrinsically, right? This isn't hard for us to understand. If someone in taking alcohol, drinking alcohol, it makes them aggressive, violent, or, well, what would we say? Well, that person should probably stop drinking. Is there anything inherently wrong with alcohol? No, but if it's causing you to act in destructive ways, then you got to leave it behind. We'd say the same thing about something like gambling. Like if you're struggling to make rent or you're struggling to put food on the table because you're gambling it all away, okay, well, that's a problem. There's a correlation there. You probably need to stop. Whatever it is that's correlated with us causing harm, those ties need to be severed. And this is what Jesus, I think, is offering here to this church. There's way too much tied up between meat sacrifice to idols and all this other awful stuff. And Jesus is saying the whole thing has to go. And so we have these three different approaches to the idol meat question. There's no universal decree. There's no firm policy or position by the church. For one church, it was like, look, this is a big issue for a lot of our church. It seems best that we just avoid that meat altogether, if possible. It's not an absolute, it's a discernment, what we think might be best for the community. For another church, it was, go ahead, eat the meat. There's no problem there. It's no big deal. Go for it. Just don't tempt other people to violate their conscience. And for another church, it was like, look, in our context, this is all way too wrapped up in this whole other awful thing. And so we just got to leave that behind. I think this example of nuance within Scripture can be very instructive for us today. I think it coaches us, if we let it, to have us enter the realm of nuance. At the end of the day, local context matters. The local life of a church, what's happening in a particular community, it matters. What is right or wrong for one person or one community may well differ from that of another. And ultimately, there's a individual element here too, because conscience is kind of on top of what is allowed to guide us. What will your conscience allow for? And whatever that is, we don't try to tempt others to violate their conscience. And so we don't have to settle all areas of conflict We don't all in a church have to be on the same page. We really don't, because like the case of Raffi Kadikian, sometimes you can be guilty of something in the strictest sense, and yet there be layers of complexity around that make things not so simple. All the issues we fight and disagree about, I'm inclined to think, are somewhat the same. Sure, there may be a right or wrong, but there's also a whole lot of complexity around it, and that requires nuanced thinking. So, when we encounter division, conflict in the world, in our churches, even in our homes, maybe we could be people of nuance, recognizing that life is complex. Context matters, conscience matters, and above all, community matters. So may we enter into the world with a fresh set of eyes, realizing we don't have to be on the same page as everyone to love everyone. That, my friends, is my word for this week. Go in peace.